Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. Start with the internal Russian picture, because that's where the clearest strain is showing up right now. Russia is dealing with a widening set of economic stress points that are increasingly tied directly to the war. Inflation pressures are persistent, growth forecasts are weak, and the central bank has been forced into another incremental rate cut down to 14.25% after a long tightening cycle. That cut might look like stability on paper, but the language coming from policymakers is more cautious than it appears. They are openly acknowledging that fiscal pressure from wartime spending is shaping the long-term interest rate path. At the same time, there is a very practical problem emerging inside the system: fuel. We are now seeing a situation where domestic gasoline shortages are not just theoretical risks, they are appearing in multiple regions. Prices are rising, supply is tightening, and in a notable development, Russia is preparing to import gasoline by sea from Asian suppliers to stabilize internal demand. That is a significant marker. It signals that domestic refining capacity and distribution are no longer fully absorbing shocks from wartime disruption and infrastructure strain. And that connects directly to what is happening on the infrastructure side. Ukraine's long-range strike campaign is increasingly focused on energy nodes that matter to internal Russian stability, not just export revenue. Refineries, depots, and logistics hubs are being hit repeatedly, including facilities in and around Moscow. The result is not just damage in isolated locations. It is a pattern of disruption that affects fuel distribution inside Russia's own system. Now, layer on the political impact of that, because it is starting to show up in behavior. The Kremlin has responded to these pressures with a mix of messaging control and internal tightening. Reporting continues to point to localized coercion in mobilization efforts, including street-level detentions and pressure campaigns to push men into military service contracts. At the same time, information control around strike reporting is being reinforced, with restrictions on what can be shared about damage inside Russian territory. So what you're seeing is a system trying to manage three pressures at once: economic strain, manpower requirements, and narrative control. Those don't move independently anymore. They are interacting. Now step outward into the diplomatic layer, because this is where the external environment around the war is also shifting. Western support for Ukraine continues to expand, but it is becoming more structured and more industrial in nature. New commitments from NATO partners and European states are increasingly focused on air defense systems, drone production, long-range capabilities, and joint manufacturing arrangements. Ukraine is not just receiving equipment anymore. It is being integrated into production networks that extend into Europe's defense industrial base. At the same time, European unity is not clean or fully aligned. There's a visible split emerging between states pushing for tighter economic and sanctions pressure on Russia and those exploring limited communication channels with Moscow. The argument inside Europe is not whether to support Ukraine in principle. It is about how to manage escalation risk versus long-term containment strategy. That tension is playing out while Ukraine is actively trying to shape the strategic environment through both diplomacy and battlefield pressure. And that brings us to the most visible, kinetic development: Ukraine's deep strike campaign into Russia's interior. Recent large-scale drone operations against Moscow have again demonstrated that Russian air defense networks, while extensive, are not impermeable under saturation conditions. Key infrastructure in the Moscow region, including a major oil refinery tied to the city's fuel supply, has been struck repeatedly. Airports around the capital have been disrupted, air traffic temporarily halted, and industrial sites damaged. But the key point here is not the number of drones or the tactical sequence of the strike. It is the effect on perception and system confidence. For years, Moscow was treated as a protected rear zone. That assumption is now under repeated challenge. Even when Russian air defenses intercept large numbers of incoming systems, enough get through to create visible disruption in the capital. That changes how domestic audiences perceive the war, especially when infrastructure tied to daily life is affected. And this is where Ukraine's strategy becomes more layered. These strikes are not just about immediate damage. They are about making the war visible inside Russia's urban centers, especially in areas that were previously insulated from it. When fuel systems, transport hubs, and industrial infrastructure are affected in Moscow itself, it introduces a different kind of pressure on decision-making at the state level. Now zoom back out into the battlefield context, but keep it tight because this is secondary to the larger system shift. Across eastern and southern Ukraine, the front line remains relatively static in terms of large territorial changes. Russian forces continue limited offensive pressure in sectors such as Kharkiv and Donetsk, relying heavily on infiltration tactics, small unit advances, and sustained drone and artillery activity rather than large mechanized breakthroughs. On the Ukrainian side, the emphasis is increasingly on logistics interdiction. That means targeting bridges, supply routes, fuel depots, command posts, and transport infrastructure across occupied territories. Areas like Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Crimea are under sustained pressure from this approach. What matters here is cumulative effect. Neither side is achieving rapid territorial shifts, but both are actively shaping the conditions that determine future mobility and supply. And layered on top of that is an evolving intelligence and information environment. Russian information operations are increasingly focused on projecting localized battlefield momentum, sometimes using imagery that is difficult to verify or flagged as potentially synthetic. The goal is less about convincing analysts and more about shaping perception of inevitability on the ground. At the same time, Ukrainian strikes inside Russia are being framed in competing narratives, either as escalation risks or as evidence of growing Ukrainian reach. That information competition now sits directly alongside the physical conflict. There is also a quieter but important regional dimension developing around Belarus. Belarus is increasingly functioning as a supporting corridor for Russian operational activity, particularly in terms of drone routes and narrative alignment. Ukrainian officials report increased drone activity entering through northern vectors associated with Belarusian airspace. At the same time, both Russian and Belarusian messaging has begun to align more closely in describing alleged Ukrainian actions tied to civilian incidents, even when those claims remain disputed or unverified. This does not look like a separate front opening. It looks more like gradual integration into Russia's wider operational ecosystem, particularly in air and information domains. Now zoom out one more level, because there is a broader strategic diffusion happening beyond Europe. Ukraine's defense ecosystem is increasingly being exported outward. Ukrainian drone manufacturers and defense firms are actively engaging with partners in Japan, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. The reason is straightforward. These states are looking at Ukraine's battlefield experience as a live model of modern unmanned warfare. We are seeing demonstrations of swarm systems, maritime drones, and AI-assisted targeting platforms being evaluated in Indo-Pacific contexts. Japan, in particular, is expanding drone procurement and exploring domestic production partnerships. Taiwan and others are assessing how these systems could fit into deterrence planning in a potential China contingency. So what begins as a European war is increasingly feeding into global military modernization trends. Finally, there is one more structural layer worth noting inside Russia itself. Alongside economic and military pressure, there is an ongoing effort to reinforce internal cohesion through identity and cultural structures. This includes state-backed civic identity campaigns in ethnically diverse regions and the expansion of organizations tied to patriotic mobilization frameworks. These efforts are designed to reinforce unity under wartime conditions, but they also highlight the underlying sensitivity around cohesion in a prolonged conflict environment. Thanks for listening and being part of this community. If you're finding value here, a review, comment, or share helps more people stay informed. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack at restrictedhandling.substack.com, where we go deeper on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Stay safe and have a great week.